themselves against the terrorists. Well, you may chuckle, but what did the gun control lobby say? It said just what we've always said. To keep the guns out of the hands of terrorists, we need strict gun control laws. Now, what do you learn from, I can tell you, pediatricians, veterinary schools, starved of funds. Who's going to protect us but us? Vet schools against hoof and mouth disease that the terrorists are going to send in here. And we've been starved for funds for decades. As we've always, in other words, everybody said the same thing. As we've always said, it's even more true now. No one could they had to take the boilerplate out of their funding in lobbying proposals and insert war on terror into it. That was true of government, of universities applying for grants across the board, corporations, everything. Just the number of NSF grants proposals that had the word terror in them skyrocketed, even though the actual research didn't change whatsoever. A couple other, if I may, very brief examples of this, because to me this is the really crucial thing. The cabal that started the war isn't in control of it anymore. There's no one in control of the war on terror. It is a thing in itself that is trying to control the country. That's what makes it so difficult. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, just see what happened to President Bush when he tried to say, it's okay if the Dubai company takes care of the ports. He couldn't say it. The war on terror wouldn't let him. In the Department of Homeland Security, they gave out billions of dollars to local and state governments. And they figured out that they had to have some official criterion for doing this. So they came up with 15 national planning scenarios, which they tried to keep secret, but which were published on the Hawaii State website. They were taken down from the Hawaii State website. I happened to find them on the Iowa State website. And so I was able to discuss them. I knew about them from other sources. Well, these are fascinating. How did they decide on these 15? In order to qualify for funding, if you were a state or county or a local government, you had to say that your locality, your state, was threatened by one of these 15. One of them, for example, was hoof and mouth disease. Another one was some kind of attack on a sports stadium. You didn't have liquid natural gas tanker attack. That was not part of them. You didn't have West Nile virus. You did have anthrax. You did have smallpox. There were kind of 15. Who produced this list? Well, it was a list that bubbled up out of the government bureaucracy, and partly on the basis of who would win and who would lose depending on which scenarios got included in the appropriate justifications for funding. So it's a political process, not an analytic process. And it's most apparent when you say, well, who did they say the enemy would be in these scenarios? Because if you say who the enemy is, that limits what kind of attacks you could imagine, and therefore limits the kind of funding that you could apply for, people could apply for. Well, I was fascinated to see the name of the enemy, the universal adversary. In other words, Satan. Every bad thing that can happen, you can't. Now, I found out, much to my amazement, and I was probably the last person that should have been amazed, that there still exists an office of the universal adversary. In the Department of Homeland Security, though you won't find it on the web, but I have the name and phone number of the person who runs it, and she just sent me materials about it. It is fantastic. They're in charge of developing fictionalized scenarios. It doesn't say why they use the term. I'm telling you why they use the term. Okay. I'll save other examples for later, or you can just read about them in the paper. All right, so why no attacks? And why was there an attack? Because now we get to the question, is there going to be another attack? Is there a threat? What is it? Am I saying there's no terrorism threat? No, I'm not saying that. You have to understand why the 9/11 attack occurred in order to understand why there haven't been any since. It was a desperate attempt by a failed group of fanatics who had not been able to do what they wanted in the Middle East and were reaching for a far enemy in some dramatic fashion to try to trigger a transformation in the Middle East that would help them and make them seem to masses of Muslims as heroes and as people who were speaking the truth about the world rather than as nutcases. It's as if the Aryan nation, which commands now about the same level of support in the United States as al-Qaeda did before 9/11 in the Muslim world, had said, how are we ever going to, we know the truth and nobody's listening to us. What are we going to do? Well, if they could have engineered an attack on Nairobi and had a black African Muslim army invade the United States in order to, then they would be the resistance heroes. And that's what al-Qaeda did. partly blind luck and partly brilliant strategy. But fundamentally, it's a form of violence that's using judo. The principle of judo is you use your enemy's strength against him. And that's what they did. They hijacked our planes, our transportation system, to knock down those buildings. Then, and this is what Americans don't realize, they hijacked our entire Madisonian democratic system of red-blooded American factional infighting for everybody goes for everything they can get. Because by transforming the agenda of we have to fight these barbarians, everybody has to say that I should get more funding, or in my agency we should have a bigger budget because we're carrying the ball in the war on terror. And every agency in the government and sub-agency had to make that argument after 9/11 or be starved of funds. So this whole Madisonian principle was hijacked. Our American political system was hijacked. And that's what thrust us into Iraq. And that's what's got us caught up in a war that no one between the people operating in the trenches and knocking down the doors and those at the very top who've eaten the Kool-Aid, that the vast professional managerial class know that it's a complete crock. But they can't get out of it. I don't know how many people I've talked to who admit, whether they're high-ranking members of Congress or inside of these organizations, yes, we know it's nuts, but if we don't get the money, they'll get it, and they will waste it. At least we're doing something useful with it. You know, I gave a talk on this. I gave this essentially the same talk to the Department of Homeland Security. When I asked why I was being invited, they said, to a week-long course on how to fight the war on terror, the head of the institute said, "We can't say it. You can." You know, I got some more details about that encounter. The first question I had from the audience was, "Are you wearing a bulletproof vest?" The last question was very different. It was, "How come, are all members of Congress getting your book?" They're trapped. I'm not blaming politicians. The press, professors, I'm blaming a little bit because they're the press and the tenured professoriate, they're the ones who are not supposed to race to the trough. They're supposed to use protected status of tenure and freedom of expression to speak the truth even when it's unpopular. But they have not. Okay, the press fell down on the war in Iraq. The professors actually spoke against the war in Iraq. When it comes to the war on terror, both of them are not only lying down, they're making money hand over fist. I also consult in the war on terror. That's how come I know most of this stuff. And we can get into exactly how can I do that in the question period. So this is a war. So this is a judo. How do you fight somebody who's using judo? A traditional side is you kind of slump, but you don't treat them as if they're really a danger to you. You don't honor them with a war when what they want is the image of fighting an apocal war against you. You do what the British and the Europeans, who have a much more serious threat than we do, and reject the idea of a war on terror, and you treat it as a problem that is handled within the institutions of law and order that we have in our society and with the constitutional protections of everyone intact. You don't do them the honor of putting them in the same category as Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany. That's exactly what they want, and that's exactly what they got. Instead, what we have, and I'll conclude here, is we've got a kind of fad of Chicken Little. On the left, it's global warming. And I'm somebody who believes in global warming, but I don't think that we need to run around with like Chicken Little and forget everything else. The same thing with the war on terror. Those who criticize the environmentalists as if they are Chicken Littles are themselves much bigger Chicken Littles when it comes to the war on terror, thinking behind every rock there's a danger that will overthrow the country, or at least talking as if they think that way. Instead, what we have to do is we have to overcome the war on terror itself. We have to begin a discourse that analyzes its logic. We can't allow it to tell us who we are and what we should be. We can't accept politicians who use slogans when they respond to questions about the war on terror. We have to know our enemy. In this case, our enemy is a small group of crazy fanatics, and we need to use our intelligence and our police and our military assets as necessary to deal with them, discreetly, behind the scenes, and with everyone who will cooperate. That's not something we can do when we politicize the war on terror as we have done. And we have to do what we did with the Soviet Union, which is to get over 5 years of McCarthyist hysteria in which we believed there were sleeper cells ready to take over the country. And we were able to manage psychologically, politically, and militarily with a much more difficult, much more serious, real threat against us of the incineration of our cities. And we were able to prevail in that struggle, and we were able to live a happy, satisfying national life and not waste trillions of dollars in counterproductive bridges to nowhere. Thank you.